The engine started before dawn. A low, heavy growl that filled the hangars of Bassingbourn and rolled over the sleeping English fields. Inside the fortress of steel and frost, men strapped in, checked gauges, adjusted their oxygen masks. The smell of fuel and damp canvas mixed with the metallic breath of November air. Somewhere above, the sky was a seamless sheet of cloud, white, endless, and deceivingly calm. No moon, no stars. Only the dull reflection of searchlights lost inside the mist. The mission briefing had been short and cold. Target, Wilhelmshaven. Expected weather, complete overcast. Rely on instruments. Do not break formation. Captain Al Mason didn't like it. Nobody did. But the orders were clear, and there was something new hanging under his bomber, a smooth glass dome replacing the familiar turret. The crew had been told little. Experimental navigation device, the engineers called it. The men had already given it a name of their own, Mickey. As the first light seeped into the hangar, Mason glanced at his crew, pale faces in the red cabin glow, hands moving with ritual precision. The interphone crackled with static. Visibility, he asked. None, came the answer from the co-pilot. Mason exhaled slowly. Then we fly blind. He looked through the cockpit window at the endless gray. The cloud stretched ahead like an ocean turned upside down, swallowing the horizon. And in that moment, before he pushed the throttle, someone behind him, maybe the navigator, maybe nobody in particular, muttered almost to himself. They said the clouds are our armor. No one replied. Hours later, above the North Sea, the truth began to show itself. The bomber shuddered under turbulence. Frost clung to the glass. The only thing visible was the pale ghost of the formation flickering on the radar scope, green blotches sliding across the circular screen. Lieutenant Frank Danner, the navigator, leaned closer, eyes wide with disbelief. I've got land echo. There, the harbor. Copy, Mason said. His voice was dry, almost reverent. Combat course. Somewhere below them, behind the veil of fog, Wilhelmshaven waited. Down on the ground, in a bunker near the docks, a German observation officer was finishing his coffee when the static began. His instruments twitched, catching fragments of a strange frequency. Too low, too brief to identify. He told his men not to worry. They can't see a thing in this weather, he said. The clouds will protect us. He never finished the sentence. The sirens started first, a hollow wail, climbing, twisting through the drizzle. Then the earth itself began to shake. The bombs fell out of nowhere, splitting the fog with light so bright it seemed unreal. Men ran for cover, not knowing which direction the attack came from. Back in the air, Danner's voice cut through the interphone, impact confirmed. Echo fading. No one spoke for a while. Just the hum of engines and the soft rattle of oxygen masks. Mason kept his hands on the yoke, steady, eyes searching the gray nothing outside. On the return flight, the silence inside the plane felt heavier than the bombs had. In the debriefing hut that afternoon, the crew's words came out clipped, distant. The intelligence officer asked if they'd had visual confirmation. Mason shook his head. Danner slid across his radar sketch, rough outlines of docks and coastlines drawn from green shadows. We never saw the ground, he said quietly. But we knew exactly where it was. When the officer looked down at the navigator's logbook later, he found a single line written in pencil. Clouds don't save you. That night, rain drummed on the hangar roof. Mechanics worked in silence, tightening bolts around the belly dome of the next fortress. Under the floodlights, the transparent sphere gleamed like an eye. A few airmen stood watching, whispering. Mason lingered longer than the rest. The dome caught the light, reflecting his face, pale, distorted, doubled by the glass. For a moment, it looked less like a machine and more like a mirror pointed at the sky. He thought of the city they had struck, unseen, unheard until the explosions bloomed in the mist. He thought of the strange green world flickering on the radar screen, where harbors and rivers glowed like ghosts. If this thing lets us see through darkness, he said quietly, then maybe the darkness will start looking back. The hangar doors slammed shut behind him, and the sound rolled down the runway like distant thunder. By morning, a sealed envelope waited on his desk. Orders, Station 102, Alconbury. Immediate transfer. Under the stamp, a single handwritten note, for radar orientation. Project H2X. He folded the paper without a word. Outside, the clouds hung low, thick as stone. They were no armor. Only the beginning of something new. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Rain carried the sound of engines across the Cambridgeshire fields, low, patient, almost human. The road to Alconbury was a narrow strip of mud, and Mason's boots sank with every step as he followed the sergeant through the fog toward a row of old hangars. A crooked sign beside the gate read, Station 102. The air smelled of oil, wet grass, and iron. Inside, technicians worked without speaking, bent over open panels and coiled cables. One of them glanced up briefly as Mason passed, an American insignia on his jacket, British accent when he spoke. You're the transfer. Captain Mason, 91st Bomb Group, he said. Good. You'll want to see the dome. They stopped beside a half-disassembled B-17, its belly sliced open like a dissected beast. Under the fuselage hung a translucent sphere of plexiglass, its surface beaded with rain. Inside it, wires, dials, and a glowing cathode tube the size of a small child's head. This, said the mechanic, tapping the glass gently, is what the boffins call H2X. The Yanks just call it Mickey. Eyes in the dark. It didn't look like a weapon. More like something alive, a heartbeat of faint light pulsing in its core. In the far corner of the hangar, men in khaki overcoats were clustered around a folding table littered with blueprints. Mason recognized the accent, Boston, maybe Cambridge. Scientists, not soldiers. One of them, a thin man with ink stains on his cuffs, extended a hand. Lieutenant Raymond Levitt, MIT Radiation Laboratory, he introduced himself. We built this thing. And now we're trying to make it survive the war. They spoke like men who'd been awake for days. Their diagrams showed the echo of a city as a series of ghostly rings, like ripples in water. Levitt pointed to one, that's the radar image of Hamburg. See the darker patch? That's the river. It's the only way to tell land from sea. Mason studied the map. And you expect my crew to drop bombs by reading that? Levitt didn't flinch. Yes. Because clouds don't stop radar. And if we can guide one formation through weather, the rest can follow. He led Mason outside, where the rain had thickened into mist. Across the field, 4 B-17s idled on the tarmac, their engines whispering through the fog. Each one had the same odd glass dome. Those are pathfinders, Levitt said. 4 leads for 4 groups. Once they find the target, the rest will drop on their cue. Think of it as, teaching the sky to see. The phrase unsettled Mason. The sky wasn't meant to see anything. That night, he was assigned to the first training flight. They took off over the Norfolk coast under blackout conditions. The crew worked by touch, no external lights, no visual horizon. The only illumination came from the radar scope glowing inside the converted turret. Lieutenant Danner, his navigator from Bassingbourn, had been transferred with him. His voice over the intercom was tight with concentration. Contact ahead. 2 miles. Looks like coastline. I don't see it, Mason said. You're not supposed to. Trust the echo. Outside, the world was a perfect void. The only sound was the rhythmic heartbeat of the engines and the occasional static in the headphones. Then Danner's tone shifted, soft, almost reverent. There's a river bend, Al. I can see the reflection. We're right over Norwich. Mason looked down through the cloud, saw nothing but darkness. Yet when he checked the clock and coordinates, they matched exactly. The radar hadn't lied. He felt something then, a strange, cold awe. As if the plane itself had learned a new sense. They circled for hours, tracing invisible patterns across the map. By the time they landed, dawn had begun to color the clouds a faint silver. The base was silent except for the hiss of the rain. Levitt met them at the dispersal hut. "How'd it feel?" he asked. "Like flying inside a dream," Mason said. "You don't know what's real until it's too late." The scientist smiled thinly. "That's war now. Machines dreaming for men." Over the next weeks, the Pathfinder group was formed, the 482nd. Crews arrived from every air division, selected for calm nerves and iron stomachs. They practiced day after day, flying blind into storms, learning to navigate not by sight but by reflection. "Trust the screen," instructors repeated. "Not your eyes. The screen never blinks." Losses came early. One training flight vanished over the North Sea, no distress call, no debris found. The rumor spread fast, the radar ghosts got them. Mason didn't believe in ghosts, but sometimes at night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the green flicker of the radar sweep behind his eyelids, the silent shimmer of unseen cities waiting beneath the clouds. By October, the first combat test was approved. The target would be Emden, on the German coast. 2 Pathfinders would lead the raid through full overcast. The briefing was short, visual impossible. H2X mandatory. They launched at dawn. For 4 hours, the formation flew through weather thick enough to chew. Radio contact broke 3 times. When the lead Pathfinder finally called the drop signal, the rest followed blindly. The bombs struck within a mile of the docks, not perfect, but enough to ignite half the harbor. Half the Pathfinders didn't return. Mason read the after-action report in silence. Levitt stood beside him, soaked in sweat and guilt. "It worked," he said softly. "Even if it cost us half the men." Mason folded the report. "You wanted to teach the sky to see," he said. "Congratulations. It's learning fast." Outside, the rain came harder, drumming against the metal roofs of Station 102. Under the hangar lights, the radar domes gleamed like eyes opening in the dark, dozens of them, waiting for orders. The next mission would be larger. More bombers, heavier targets. Somewhere over the horizon, a city none of them had yet seen waited behind a wall of cloud. And when the call came from headquarters, operational test, target Wilhelmshaven, November 3rd, nobody asked what the weather would be. Because now they knew, the clouds were no longer protection. They were cover. The morning began like a rumor, cold, shapeless, impossible to grasp. At Station 102, fog lay thick over the field, swallowing the rows of bombers until only the tips of their wings showed through like gravestones. The men moved quietly, voices low, every sound dampened by the mist. Somewhere a generator coughed, then fell silent. "Mission confirmed," the operations officer said, his voice echoing off the damp concrete. "Target, Wilhelmshaven. Weather, full overcast. Pathfinder lead." Nobody asked questions. They had practiced for this, weeks of blind flights, endless hours staring at that green screen until it haunted their dreams. Now it was real. Captain Mason ran a hand along the cold metal of his aircraft. The dome beneath the belly glowed faintly in the hangar light. Inside it, the radar hummed with a soft pulse, like a living thing. He could feel it through his boots. Lieutenant Danner climbed aboard, carrying the radar logs and a stack of grease pencils. "Visibility 0, he said. "Perfect day for ghosts." Mason didn't smile. "Then let's haunt them." By 0700, the first engine started. The sound rolled across the airfield, a deep, synchronized growl that vibrated through the fog. One by one, the flying fortresses lifted off into the white sky, swallowed within seconds. At 12,000 feet, the world ceased to exist. There was no horizon, no up or down. Just white. The inside of a dream. Mason held the yoke steady, eyes flicking between the compass and the artificial horizon. Every few seconds, he glanced at the radar operator's screen, though he couldn't read it. Danner's voice came through the intercom, calm, measured, confident. Land echo forming. Coastline in 5 minutes. Copy. The formation was invisible, each bomber trusting the invisible wake of the one ahead. Mason imagined hundreds of men suspended in the same cloud, listening to the same static hiss, breathing the same recycled air. Course steady, Danner said. Harbor's coming up, looks like a crescent shape, 2 inlet channels. That's her. On the ground, in a command post outside Wilhelmshaven, German officers stood over a map, convinced the weather made an attack impossible. No bombers today, one said. They can't navigate blind. Then the telephones began to ring, first from the coastal batteries, then from the radar stations. The reports made no sense. Unidentified returns, faint but precise, approaching fast. Impossible, the colonel muttered. They shouldn't even see us. But high above the clouds, the lead Pathfinder had already opened its bomb bay. Bombs away on lead, Mason ordered. The phrase echoed through a dozen formations, each invisible to the other yet bound by that single signal. Seconds later, the first explosions rolled up through the clouds, dull, distant, like thunder heard through water. The aircraft jolted from the shockwave. The bombardier's voice came through, breathless, good drop. Confirmed hits. Mason glanced at Danner. The radar operator was still staring at the glowing screen, eyes wide. You see that? He whispered. Echoes changing shape. That's fire. The docks are burning. They couldn't see the city, but they could feel it dying beneath them. Back in Wilhelmshaven, panic spread faster than the flames. Men ran through streets they couldn't even see the enemy above. The sirens drowned in the roar of collapsing buildings. The clouds hid everything, except the sound. In the air, a sudden flash lit the cockpit, flak bursting blindly through the fog. Mason's reflexes tightened. Evasive left, he shouted. The bomber lurched, groaning under the strain. Shrapnel rattled off the fuselage like hail. Danner's screen flickered, then steadied. Still have the harbor. We're clear of the target. The intercom buzzed with voices from the trailing planes, reports of minor hits, of aircraft lost from view. One gunner said quietly, "It's like flying through milk, except milk that kills you." Hours later, when they crossed the English coast, the clouds began to thin. Pale sunlight touched the wings for the first time that day. Only then did the men realize how tense they'd been, jaws locked, hands cramped on the controls. At debriefing, the air smelled of wet wool and coffee. The mission officer read out the reconnaissance reports, primary target struck. Harbor installations damaged. Minimal visual confirmation. Mason sat silent, staring at the floor. Danner closed his logbook. Inside, beneath his neat coordinates, he'd written a single note. We didn't see the city. But we knew exactly where it was. Levitt from the MIT team arrived later, soaked from the rain, holding a telegram. The test worked, he said quietly. You proved it can be done. Mason looked at him, exhausted. We also proved it shouldn't have to be. That night, the men gathered in the mess hall. Nobody talked about the mission. Outside, the wind howled against the tin roof. Someone turned on the radio, Glenn Miller, faint and crackling, but it only made the silence heavier. Before dawn, Mason walked back to the hangar. The radar dome still dripped with condensation. Inside it, the cathode tube glowed faintly green, like an eye that never slept. He touched the glass. It was warm. On a workbench nearby lay the next day's operation orders. The ink hadn't dried yet. One word stood out, Berlin. Mason exhaled slowly, reading the date. November 26th. 3 weeks away. He turned off the light, and for a moment the hangar was swallowed in darkness. Then the radar's afterglow lingered, a faint, ghostly circle fading in the air like the memory of a target already found. Somewhere in that glow, the future of warfare was being born, and none of them could look away. Berlin believed the sky was its shield. On March 3, 1944, the clouds returned, thick, merciful, endless. But this time, mercy had run out. The air above East Anglia was already roaring when dawn broke. Engines of 400 flying fortresses vibrated through the mist, their exhaust trails vanishing into one vast grey ceiling. Men stood in silence as they watched the formations rise, hundreds of dots swallowed one by the same cloud that covered Europe. In the control tower, a voice over the radio crackled through static. "Mickey lead, confirm visual." A pause. Then, calm and unmistakable, confirmed. "It's Berlin." No one saw the city. No one ever would that day. At 20,000 feet, Captain Mason's crew flew blind, the world erased into a single color, a dirty white that hid both heaven and hell. The radar screen pulsed faintly in the dim light of the fuselage, like a heartbeat. Danner's hand traced the ghostly outlines. "We're over the Spree," he said quietly. "Dead center." Mason peered through the cockpit window. Nothing. Just the void. "You sure?" Danner didn't answer. The operator's eyes flicked across the radar's phosphor glow, reading reflections invisible to human sight. "I'm sure," he whispered. "Berlin's right beneath us." Below, the city was silent. The overcast hung low, muting every sound. The anti-aircraft crews at Tempelhof and Tegel smoked their morning cigarettes, half convinced the weather had given them another day of safety. They could barely hear the distant hum above the clouds, a far-off oceanic moan. "Americans won't fly in this," said one officer, wrapping his coat tighter. "Not blind. Not here." But in that same instant, the sky trembled. A single bomb broke the silence, falling unseen through miles of vapor. The explosion rolled upward, shaking windows, scattering pigeons. Then another. And another. Within a minute, the entire city was quivering under an invisible assault. "They're dropping," someone shouted. Through the clouds. Panic spread faster than the smoke. Searchlights whipped wildly, cutting through nothing. The flak batteries fired blindly, shells bursting inside the white curtain. To the gunners, it felt like shooting at ghosts. Inside the lead fortress, Mason could feel each burst as a vibration through the hull. Shrapnel clattered across the fuselage. Oxygen masks hissed. Nobody spoke. The bombs were already gone, dropped on coordinates that existed only as shadows on a radar screen. "Jesus," murmured the bombardier. "We're bombing a city we can't even see." Danner didn't look up. "We see enough." In the distance, radio chatter filled with fragmented voices, squadrons confirming drops, formation leaders marking echoes, gunners reporting phantom flashes. Somewhere below, Berlin was burning, a wound glowing faintly through the overcast, the reflection so bright it appeared on radar as a bloom of light. "Target confirmed," Danner said, voice shaking. Echo expanding. Mason felt the weight of it, the strange power of striking a city by faith alone. He looked at the radar screen, saw the smudge that meant thousands of lives below, and thought, this is what it means to see without eyes. Back on the ground, the German command tried to understand. Their meteorological division had guaranteed total cloud cover. Their early warning systems had registered nothing until the bombs were already falling. Operators spoke of strange interference, signals flickering across uncharted frequencies. One technician, listening through his headphones, caught the faint hum of the American radar and said, "It's not ours, it's something else. Something new." At Tempelhof, an officer stared up into the gray sky and whispered, "They can see us. But we can't see them." The raid lasted less than an hour. Then the fortresses turned west, disappearing back into the wall of weather. When the clouds finally broke that afternoon, Berlin's southern districts were burning, rail yards, factories, entire rows of housing blackened. The sky, once their shield, had betrayed them. At Alconbury, the pathfinders returned to rain and silence. The crews walked from their aircraft as if sleepwalking. No one spoke of accuracy or results, only of the strange emptiness that came from hitting what you could not see. Danner cleaned the radar screen with a cloth, his reflection pale in the glass. Berlin looked like a heartbeat, he said softly. Bright, then fading. Mason wrote his report in the debriefing tent. Under visibility, he left the box blank. At the bottom he added a single line. We bombed silence, and silence answered back. That evening, while engineers checked the aircraft, the intelligence staff received an intercepted German communication. It mentioned an unidentified signal, too short for radio, too steady for radar. Their scientists couldn't trace it. One of the analysts smiled grimly. They've noticed us, he said. Levitt, the MIT scientist, stood nearby, exhausted but alert. Then it's only a matter of time before they start looking for our frequency. Mason closed his flight log, his hands still trembling. Let them look, he muttered. They won't find it. But deep inside Germany, in dim rooms filled with equipment and static, engineers had already begun to listen. Something had struck fear into them, a sound beneath the noise, an invisible pulse moving through the clouds. Someone in Berlin reportedly said it first, in a report later translated and filed in Allied archives. They have a new eye. And it sees us. The sound came first, a thin, shifting hum, like wind through a broken wire. In a basement laboratory outside Bremen, German engineers leaned close to their headphones, brows furrowed. That's not our frequency, one said. It's too short. They adjusted the dials. The hum flickered, vanished, then returned, steady, pulsing, alive. Somewhere above, invisible in the March clouds, American bombers were already crossing the coast. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe had a new obsession, the invisible eye. Rumors had spread since Wilhelmshaven and Berlin, stories of Allied bombers that could find their targets through storms, through night, through the thickest smoke. The word Mickey had surfaced in intercepted chatter, but nobody knew what it meant. Engineers called it Das Gespenst, the ghost. In a darkened room at the Rechlin Testing Center, they replayed fragments of intercepted static, searching for a pattern. Oscilloscopes flickered with ghostly lines. If they use radar, we can trace them, insisted Dr. Klaus Adler, the physicist in charge of countermeasures. Every wave leaves a footprint. His assistant shook his head. Not this one. It slips between bands. The detectors read nothing. Adler stared at the screen. Then we build a new ear. Thus began Project Naxos Z, an urgent attempt to hunt the ghost signal. Dozens of technicians worked through nights under the dim light of carbide lamps, building prototypes that hummed and smoked and failed. They caught echoes of everything, British radar, civilian radio, even lightning, but never the real source. The American X-band, they discovered too late, was beyond their reach. Meanwhile, in the sky over France, the ghosts kept coming. Captain Mason's Pathfinder crew had become veterans of blind raids, calm voices in static, men who trusted radar more than sunlight. Their aircraft now carried a second-generation H-2X dome, smoother, quieter, more precise. The screens no longer showed only shapes, they showed patterns, rivers, grids of streets. Danner, the radar operator, had begun to speak of cities as if he could see them with his hands. Paris looks different from above, he told Mason one evening, tracing the outline of the Seine on a scrap of paper. Even through cloud, you can feel its symmetry. They were flying missions almost nightly now, rail yards, airfields, factories. Most under full cover, guided only by the green glow in the belly of the fortress. Reports from German night fighter crews became stranger with each week. Pilots described light beneath the clouds, like eyes opening. Others claimed to have seen nothing at all until tracer fire erupted around them. One report simply read, enemy invisible. Attack felt, not seen. In Berlin, Adler listened to these testimonies and scowled. Fear makes men poetic, he said. But we'll find their secret. He never did. By June, the front was collapsing. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Radar-guided strikes hit roads, bridges, convoys, always through fog, always unseen. Each time the Luftwaffe prepared for bad weather, they assumed safety. Each time, the bombs fell anyway. For the Americans, it was a strange kind of faith. They no longer looked for cities, they looked for signatures, reflections, ghosts of geometry. The human eye had become unnecessary. During one mission in late July, Mason's crew flew over a vast bank of cloud stretching across northern France. Danner leaned toward his screen, whispering, "There it is, Paris." Mason frowned. "You sure? It hasn't been liberated yet." "I'm sure," Danner said softly. "It's whole. You can see the bridges." They didn't drop that day, the target lay farther east, but the image stayed with them. The city glowing faintly, untouched, suspended in time. That night, Danner wrote in his logbook. "We flew above Paris. On the screen, it was perfect. Still under occupation, but still shining. We knew we'd see its light again." Back in Germany, the frustration deepened. The Naxos C team had built detectors tuned to every known Allied radar frequency, all useless. The ghost remained invisible, untouchable. Adler stood before his weary engineers and said quietly, "If we cannot find their eyes, perhaps we should learn to hide from them." But hiding was no longer possible. The sky itself had turned traitor. Reports came from the Ruhr, from Hamburg, from Munich, bombs dropped through weather that should have protected them. Soldiers whispered that the Americans could see through God's own clouds. One pilot, after crash landing near Hanover, described watching his base destroyed while the sky above remained pure white. "It was as if the clouds had eyes," he said. By late summer, the German air defense network was unraveling, not from lack of guns, but from lack of certainty. They no longer trusted the sky. In Allied briefings, the tone had shifted. Radar wasn't a novelty anymore, it was doctrine. Pathfinders led every wave, their screens dictating life and death below. Mason understood what that meant. "Technology's moving faster than conscience," he told Danner quietly one evening. The navigator only nodded. In an after-action report dated July 27, a single line stood out in Danner's handwriting. "We didn't see the enemy, but he knew we saw him." The next page carried a note from headquarters: "Prepare for transition to advanced H-2X models. Full radar integration by autumn." For the crews, it meant another layer of darkness, more missions, fewer eyes, greater faith in the screen. For the Germans, it meant despair. Their scientists kept listening, building, hoping to catch the phantom wave. But every night the hum returned, just beyond reach, that same invisible pulse echoing through the clouds. Somewhere above, unseen and untouchable, the ghost kept watching. August 1944. The night smelled of rain and engine oil. In the ready room at Alconbury, someone had left the radio on, Glenn Miller's orchestra drifting softly between bursts of static. Outside, the air hummed with the slow heartbeat of generators. Lieutenant Frank Danner spoke quietly, almost to himself, "When we come back from missions, I always shut the radar off last. Watch the image fade. It's like the city dies in front of me." No one answered. The men just listened to the sound of the wind pushing against the hangar walls. By now, Mickey was no longer a secret. Every Pathfinder carried it, a smooth dome of glass that reflected the faint green glow of its own power. Crews treated it like a living thing. They'd tap the casing before takeoff, as if it could hear them. "Keep us safe, Mickey," they'd say. Some claimed the radar had moods, sometimes clear and sharp, sometimes blind and sluggish. "He sees more than we do," one gunner joked, and no one laughed. The missions had changed. They no longer waited for clear skies or daylight. The orders came, weather, irrelevant. The world outside the fuselage had become meaningless, only the screen mattered. Danner spent hours staring into that screen. He said it began to feel like memory itself, not a picture of the present, but a reflection of what had already vanished. Cities glowed for seconds, then faded. Rivers pulsed like veins. Each return on the radar was a heartbeat that soon stopped. On one flight over the Ardennes, the radar flickered, and Mason asked, "What do you see?" "Just smudges," Danner said. "But every smudge, it's someone's home." The line stuck with them. For the rest of the war, the crews repeated it in different forms, quietly, in the dark, as if confessing to themselves. That autumn, losses among Pathfinder units began to rise. Flying blind meant flying low, trusting invisible instruments. A single malfunction, a moment of turbulence, and a fortress could vanish into the clouds forever. In September, one training flight never returned. No radio call, no wreckage found. Danner looked at their last radar trace, a cluster of faint dots over the North Sea, and whispered, "That's all that's left of them." Mason folded the report. "They disappeared the same way they lived," he said. "Inside the fog." Yet the missions continued. Factories near Cologne, bridges along the Rhine, marshalling yards in Hanover, all struck through weather so thick that not a single bomb aimer saw his target. Back at base, mechanics wiped condensation from the domes and whispered that the radar could remember, that it stored the echoes of every city it had seen. One night, an operator swore he'd glimpsed an image of Paris long after they'd turned inland, as if the machine was replaying the past. Levitt, the scientist from MIT, dismissed it as nonsense, but he looked uneasy. "Machines don't dream," he said. "We do." Still, when he left the hangar, he glanced back at the glowing green eyes beneath the aircraft. They seemed to watch him go. Winter came early. Frost formed on the runways, fog never lifted. The men's faces grew hollow, their eyes ringed with gray. They had become part of the machines they flew, quiet, exact, detached. In December, during a mission toward Kassel, Mason's plane flew into a thunderhead so dense the instruments flickered out. For 30 seconds, they were blind. When the radar came back to life, the screen showed nothing but static, a storm made visible. "Everything's gone," Danner said. "Then hold course," Mason answered. "Even ghosts have directions." They made it home, barely. Others didn't. That night, Danner wrote one final line in his logbook before sleep overtook him. "Mickey keeps us alive. But he helps us kill, too." He closed the book, but the afterimage of the radar screen stayed behind his eyelids, that cold, pulsing green that had replaced the stars. At the year's end, headquarters announced a new radar model, sharper images, longer range, faster sweeps. Progress, they called it. Mason looked at the blueprints and felt nothing. "Sharper doesn't mean better," he said quietly. "It just means there'll be less left to guess." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and soundless. The sky looked peaceful, but he no longer trusted peace. Somewhere beyond the clouds, cities were still glowing on screens, each one a faint ghost of itself. And among the crews, a quiet wish began to spread, unspoken but shared. To see the sky again, with their own eyes. Even if it meant seeing too much. March 1945. The air over Europe was clear again, sharp, almost painfully so. No more endless gray, no more hiding behind clouds. The war was ending, but the sky had changed forever. Captain Al Mason stood on the edge of the runway at Alconbury, hands deep in the pockets of his worn flight jacket. The hangars were nearly empty now. Crews were being sent home or reassigned. Engines that had once thundered through the night sat silent, their propellers bound in canvas. He watched the dawn climb over the English fields, the same pale light that had once meant another mission. Now it only revealed the stillness. Beside him, Lieutenant Frank Danner carried the last of the radar logs, bound with string. "They want these for the archives," he said. "Every trace, every target, every return." Mason nodded. "Every ghost." Inside the hangar, technicians worked on removing the radar domes from the underbellies of the remaining fortresses. The glass spheres hung like empty eyes, lifeless without power. One cracked during disassembly, scattering green reflections across the floor. Nobody bothered to fix it. Levitt, the MIT scientist, was there too, supervising the removal. He had grown thinner, older, his uniform sleeves rolled to the elbows. "They'll use it in civil aviation now," he said. "Mapping. Weather tracking. Maybe even peace." Mason gave a small, tired smile. "Good. Let it see something worth looking at." In the briefing hut, the blackboard still bore the faint outlines of old missions: Berlin, Cologne, Kassel. The dates were fading, rubbed half away. Someone had written a single word beneath them in chalk: "Done." The men drifted in one by one, not out of duty but habit. They sat on benches, smoking in silence. For months, their lives had been ruled by schedules and signals, by the hum of radar and the pulse of engines. Now there was only quiet. Danner broke it first. "Do you remember the sound?" Mason looked at him. "Which one?" "The radar. That low hum. Like breathing. I still hear it at night." Mason nodded slowly. "You will. For a while." Outside, someone powered up a generator for the last time. The familiar whir filled the air, steady, mechanical, oddly comforting. The men listened, half expecting a mission order to follow. But none came. The sound faded into the wind. Across Europe, the last of the Pathfinder missions were winding down. In March, the 8th Air Force bombed rail hubs east of the Rhine. In April, the focus shifted to supply drops for advancing ground troops. By May, the war in Europe was over. When the news reached the base, there was no cheer, no parade. Just a long exhale, as if the entire station had been holding its breath for years. That evening, Mason walked through the empty hangars one last time. Dust hung in the air, catching the golden light from the open doors. He stopped beside a dismantled radar unit, its cathode screen dark and cold. For a moment, he imagined turning it on, just to see if anything was still out there. But he didn't. Some things were meant to fade. Later, at his bunk, he wrote a final note in his journal. "We flew in darkness, and it taught us to see. But we saw too much." He closed the book, and the silence settled around him, a silence thick with everything that had come before. Months later, he would hear that the radar technology had moved on, fitted to passenger planes, used for navigation, for weather forecasting, for exploring the Earth itself. The eye that once guided bombs now guided travelers. Progress, they called it. And yet, for the men who had lived inside that green light, progress was only part of the story. When they thought of radar, they didn't see safety or precision. They saw the flicker of cities on a screen, not dots and lines, but memories. Hamburg. Berlin. Paris. Danner, now home in Ohio, wrote to Mason that autumn. Sometimes, his letter read, "When it rains, I still imagine the echoes moving through the clouds. As if Mickey's still up there, watching us. Not judging. Just, remembering." Mason never replied. There was nothing to add. In later years, when historians asked about those early missions, he spoke sparingly. He told them about the noise of the engines, the smell of the cabin, the strange beauty of lightning inside a cloud. But when they asked what the radar screen looked like, he paused, then said, "It looked like the truth." And the truth was never clean. He died in 1967, long before satellites or digital maps. But in his flight log, preserved in an archive in Cambridge, there's a final line written in fading ink, the last entry before the pages go blank. "The clouds will never be shelter again." After the war, the radars that once pierced darkness became instruments of peace. They charted storms, mapped coastlines, guided travelers across oceans. But for those who had seen what lay beneath the clouds, the green glow always meant something else, a reminder that knowledge and mercy rarely travel together. In the quiet that followed the echo, men learned to see not with machines, but with memory. And sometimes, when the sky turned gray again, they still looked up, searching not for enemies, but for themselves.